fringes. They do. It's not that they have to conform with the precepts of Brussels. You see, in many examples, think about Ukraine things. I mean, Ukraine was posited as this country that is the buffer, and it's being contested by the West and the East, and the Ukrainians are on the receiving end of the story. All we discovered in the war that they are fighting. They have a cause there, and they're resisting neo-imperial project, and they can galvanize Western policy. So they're not objects of policy; they are subjects. And on the negative side, Orbans and the Kaczynskis of this world are also agents. They can resist, they can manipulate policy, they can drive it forward. So that's in the spirit of decentering positive but also negative way. And so the second point, the last one I want to make in order to conform with my 7 minutes of glory, and it's very much in line with what Calypso believes in Nora believes, is that European expansion also highlights the role of societies. Now, the rule of law cannot be advanced or consolidate without local buy-in. In an ideal world, pressure from the European Commission, say through attaching conditionality to European financial transfers, can only succeed if there is sufficient push from below, from citizens in countries in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, actually demanding accountability and transparency from elites and institutions and governments. So my response to the question can be pretended sport. I mean, whatever they pretend, it's a goal pretender or a young pretender. I think it's a good thing that the EU is pushing. And I have no moral problem that the EU is being imperialist in the world in carrying the flag. But in order to succeed, this is only a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. It cannot succeed unless enough people in Belgrade or in Ankara, for that matter, will be demanding the same. So it has to be a synergy. It has to be in cross action. So this is my sort of response to Calypso, and I hope in the spirit of and this is reach sort of a common point of agreement.
Thank you very much, Dimo, for reminding us that Erdogan tended to be a European in 2004, and also to taking us to the question of how we relate to countries like Turkey and Russia. I should have mentioned at the beginning that we're working very closely with Calypso and EUI in this centre on our Europe in a Changing World project on what we call the citrus countries: China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the US. So I hope in this conversation we can address the question of how we best relate to them, and how it might go down, for example, with India, if they heard Dimo saying that we have no problem with the EU being imperialist. But thank you.
Well, look, I mean, I grew up in a different empire. So if I have to choose between two empires, I settle for Brussels every day.
Sure. Okay, on we go. Nora.
Hi, I just want to test out the sound here. Hold on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Because I was having trouble with the voices. There's a wonderful cacophony in the room, evocative of all of the amazing conversations and very sort of stimulating interactions that I've had so many of in that space that you're gathered in. And of course, it's heartrending not to be able to join you, but it is also a long trip, and I am now actually joining you from California. It's 6:30 in the morning. There may be small children percolating through the space in a little bit. I've tried my best to keep them at bay, but we shall see how the next hour unfolds. So in any case, even though I can't be there in person, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join you. and to celebrate Calypso's presence, her inspiration, and her legacy, you know, for all of us gathered in these physical and virtual rooms. It's I'm also grateful to the European Studies Center, to University of Oxford for bringing us together today. And I wanted to hone in on two of the prompts which will enable me also to develop some of the themes that both Dimo and Timothy just raised. So this question of how do we decenter Eurocentrism and truly become a post-colonial power capable of partnerships, of meaningful partnerships with countries in the global South. And in this context, you know, you mentioned a couple of sort of very key players in the global South that are emerging to take on order-shaping roles. So in this context, whose hegemony, you know, should we be most attentive to? How do we grapple with hegemony in a decentered world? And so I shall try and do so in my not 15 minutes of fame, my 7 minutes or so, by a work that we've done with Calypso. We've co-authored, I think, 5 pieces and counting together, as well as my solo work, which draws inspiration from Turkey, as a sort of hybrid entity with both post-colonial and post-imperial features. And this is a condition that I have theorized and written about a lot, and also in terms of the practical implications. We have eminent journalists and policymakers in the room, so I also think about the sort of real-world applications of the family resemblances, as I put it, between Turkey and other, you know, quote unquote, non-European but post-imperial entities like Iran, China, Russia, arguably India, and so forth. And so what does it mean basically to de-Eurocenter and engage meaningfully with post-coloniality in a world where you have a proliferation of sort of post-colonial come post-imperial powers that are seeking to both restore perhaps sort of former forms of hegemony and or that are generating new forms of hegemony. And so to do so, I'm going to invoke an idea that Calypso and I played with it was a 2015 piece entitled Post-Imperial Europe, about which Timothy Garton has also recently written under that label. So this is an idea that we reprised in a recent textbook chapter that we contributed to Gustol and Schuntz's book on European external action, which is the idea that if you need to grapple with the post-colonial and the post-imperial alike, yes, we need to focus on the colonial and the imperial part of those formulations, but it's also helpful just to focus on the post component of those formulations. So what does it mean to be post anything? And our argument was that post is can involve, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It can involve post as the reproduction of hegemony, and then post as the transcendence of hegemony. So, you know, in both cases, you had the colonial projects, the imperial projects that came beforehand that have shaped what comes afterwards. So you can't, you know, there's a lot of discussions about whether we should say decolonial and how to adopt anti-colonial postures, and this is all and well, but especially I think in European context and in the theaters that we're discussing, like the Middle East or Greater Eurasia, you know, it's kind of hard to get away from the reality of European colonialism and imperialism and its legacies, and also the realities and legacies of Ottoman or Persian or Russian or Chinese colonialism or imperialism, depending on which word you prefer. So sort of unpacking this idea of post as the reproduction is the sort of the afterlives, as it were, of hegemonic projects. I think that we can sort of disaggregate in terms of the structural types of post is reproduction. So things like infrastructure, right? Things like the legacies of languages and the kind of legal frameworks that we use to communicate. So in this sense, I think that we were far from, and will certainly not in my lifetime ever get anywhere near a sort of post-colonial or post-imperial Europe because of the various lingua franca that the both current nation states within the European Union and beyond in Britain, the languages, the diasporas, the trade connections. These are sort of hard formations that are baked into the way we conduct world affairs. And so in that sense, Europe and maybe Russia and in some respects, Turkey and China will never be fully post, will always recreate elements of their former hegemony. And part and parcel of this, so a second element of post of reproduction is the post-imperial as hierarchy, right? As the use of English or French, or the power of Istanbul as a city that gathers the sort of the peoples in the capital of its hinterland, of the former Ottoman hinterland. And so, in this case, in terms of Europe's post-imperial legacy, I think the role of colonial capitalism is something that we really cannot ignore. Today, this week, many of us have been thinking about inevitably thinking about the Titanic submersive and how, the tragedy for those people who are within it, but also the juxtaposition of their tragedy with the tragedy of the boat that went that failed carrying hundreds of migrants across the Mediterranean. And so in this case, there was the people populating both vessels were cosmopolitan. Those are legacies of empire as well, but there's this huge discrepancy in terms of the attention and resources devoted to caring for those who have inherited the mantle of colonial capitalism, which we today often use the shorthand of neoliberalism to describe, versus those who have been the subalterns within that context. And yet at the same time, I do think as a positive legacy of the imperial or the colonial, we do have traces of cosmopolitanism, right, that are baked into our societies. If Britain is a multicultural society today, if the United States is a multicultural society today, if the European project is cosmopolitan, this is also a legacy of imperialism, of colonial capitalism, and is something that I think is maybe more a precious sort of legacy that we can seek to cultivate. When I think about Turkey, the legacies of Ottoman multiculturalism are also amongst the precious legacies of that period, even though there are other legacies that are perhaps less salubrious. And then all of this translates, so that's the structural side of post as reproduction. Then there's the cultural side, right? Good old Marxist reasoning, you have structure and you have superstructure. So at the cultural level, we also have habits of being post-imperial, ways of imagining ourselves as centered either in European spaces or in the Turkish context in kind of post-Ottoman spaces that really kind of enshrine the primacy of certain types of people and not of others. And so this is one of the sort of the big challenges, one legacy of empire that we see in the Russian context is again this habit, this presumption that Moscow has a right and even a moral imperative to recenter its hegemony vis-a-vis small states, smaller actors whose agencies are overshadowed. And this is partially about how, Dimo referred to the kind of the role of populist and the role of sort of new communication instruments and strategies and helping to sort of reconfigure these self-centering habits that are legacies of imperial past, which we need to transcend. So that brings me to post transcendence. I think I'm probably running out of time. How much time do I have?
Very little, I'm afraid, Nora.
Sorry, I can't. I had the volume also, it didn't echo.
I'm waiting. Afraid. You have really just a minute or two.
Right. Okay. So post-transcendence, I'll throw this out there. We can get to it in the discussion. Post-transcendence, we need to, first we need to recognize that which has been erased. All too often, the agencies and voices of those who were dominated by formal imperial entities are ignored. So there needs to be recognition. That also involves atonement for violence committed. This is something that I think is really crucial for the EU, also vis-a-vis the other former empires I was discussing. It's not, and there's also, I think, again, something to talk about. How do you atone? I think there's something to be learned from some EU member states about how to atone better than others. Germany being a case in point. It doesn't do for Brussels or Paris to wag their fingers at Beijing or Moscow or Turkey when there's serious legacies of imperialism and colonialism that for which Europeans have not atoned for. Post-transcendence involves, again, this centering of humility, and I was going to close with the idea that it involves a need to learn relationally from others. So it's not just about decentering to sort of belittle, one's role and legacy in the world, but it's about actively trying to learn from what others who have confronted legacies of imperialism, for better or worse, have extracted from that experience and how they're seeking to move forward. And I have a last point, but I'll bring it up in the discussion about the way the post-transcendence itself can be weaponized. And if someone would care to raise that topic in the Q&A or in the discussion, I'd be happy to go back to the example of Turkey and how even sort of the moral act of confronting the past and this sort of post-colonial ethics can in fact also be abused in post-imperial ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora, and we'll certainly come back to you in discussion. Thank you for raising the question of the relationship between the economic and the cultural, whether it is indeed base and superstructure, as in these Marxist books that Timo carried down onto our shelves, which I would question, but also for reminding us that we are dealing with very often with countries which are both post-colonial and post-imperial. That is to say, they both have been colonized, and that's a really important experience, but also look back to their own imperial tradition. I think it's an important point. It's worth adding that in the meantime, in the enlarged EU, you have the familiar phenomenon of major European states that were imperial powers, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal. But you also have a growing number of European member states in Eastern Europe that themselves had the experience of being colonized. And so Europe itself as an actor is both post-imperial and post-colonial. With that, let me move on to Tobias.
Sure, thank you. It's very nice to be back after so many years. I think I finished here about 10 or 11 years ago, started about 15 years ago. And I thought maybe the only phase that I was still going to recognize was going to be yours, Calypso. But now it feels a little bit like a class gathering, really, which is nice. Phases have aged, arguably, but there's also no.
But we haven't, right?
So what I want to do is kind of turn the gaze outwards, away from Europe, towards other regions of the world and their attempts to try to adopt parts of the EU model, and then kind of look back what that means for the European Union. So I think most of us in this room do share the broad notion that European integration does stand as one of the big success stories in terms of large-scale human cooperation in the world. And quite unlike many of the empires that we've seen, all of this is broadly voluntary. It's not forced, right? So naturally, that raises the question, can that be exported? What can others learn from the European experience? And that's a question I've struggled with for a long time, that I wrote my PhD about in parts a long time ago, and I've continued thinking about since. And Calypso has always pushed me to not just engage the analytical questions related to this, but also the normative, bring out some of the normative implications for Europe and Europe's attempts to try to promote its own model. And what I'm going to try to do is to explain to you why I think that the European model is rather unique and cannot really be exported. So I'm quite skeptical of the EU exporting Europe idea. And I want to do that in say 3 steps. I'm going to start out by saying a little bit about why I think it's hard to export the EU model. I'm going to give you an example, a drastic example, arguably, of a case in which an export of the EU to the regional organization in Southern Africa has failed big time. And then I'm going to try to draw out some of the normative implications of that for Europe. So the main reason for why I'm skeptical about the EU's ability to export is that the circumstances inside of Europe that have led to the success of European integration do simply not exist or not obtain in other parts of the world, right? Europe is unique in many ways, and I'm thinking here of 3 main things that I think have contributed largely to the success of European integration that we don't really have elsewhere. The first thing is, if you think about the beginnings of European integration, the hegemonic power in the center of Europe, namely Germany, had just been defeated in the war, which meant that Germany was willing to be bound by an unprecedented degree of supranational rules in order to be readmitted to the club of civilized nations, right? And that does not obtain elsewhere. In general, hegemons are very reluctant to be bound by rules, and they don't like to make big concessions to smaller member states. I think a second quite unique and important context was the Cold War itself, or the emerging Cold War at the beginning of European integration. The United States basically provided for Europe's security, which meant that Europe could focus on economic integration uninhibited in many ways by kind of the larger environment in which Europe was embedded. And that freed it of a lot of potential conflict that could have ensued. And then thirdly, and I'm not quite sure how important that is that we're talking about a fairly homogeneous regions of democratic states in Europe. Again, a condition that doesn't really obtain elsewhere. And then the idea of the rule of law that often comes with it. I think that has also been a strong facilitating factor. And so looking at these, I think, core conditions for the success of European integration and seeing that they don't exist elsewhere means that the European model, or the EU model, if you want to use that word, is not replicable elsewhere. In fact, European integration would probably not be replicable even inside of Europe, were it to start today, as opposed to 70 years ago. Right? And so I think the least we can hope for is to say that replicating or trying to learn something from Europe elsewhere means that we need to think not about the institutions and procedures that the EU has put in place, but we need to think about how similar outcomes can be obtained with a different set of procedures and institutions. Okay. And so the example that I found quite illuminating in that sense is the example of the so-called SADC Tribunal. SADC is a regional organization in Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Community, which tried to put in place an ECJ-type international court. And that court existed for about 5 years until it was dismantled by member states because arguably it had overstepped its boundaries. Now, interestingly, when we look at a lot of the research on the ECJ has been a core actor in the process of European integration. It's contributed to constitutionalizing European integration by giving access to private actors, not just member states who don't like to sue each other. And the idea has been that private actors who sue for self-interested reasons give judges the opportunity to develop European law in integrationist ways. And when European experts went to South Africa, was thinking about some kind of dispute settlement mechanism at the time, they were advising along these lines. You should put in place an ECJ type thing for the reasons that I've mentioned. And so this is what they did, and the EU financed a lot of the judges that were being employed in that court. And the second case that the SADC tribunal was called to adjudicate on was on the Zimbabwean land reform. So Robert Mugabe at the time had just expropriated white farmers in Zimbabwe. And the farmers, knowing that they wouldn't be able to do anything about that in national courts, went to the SADC tribunal and sued against this. And the court said, you're right, this is against SADC law. And Mugabe was so upset that he didn't just not implement the ruling, but dismantled the whole court. So it existed for about 5 years, right? And it does show that simply giving access to private actors is not a recipe that works everywhere in order to develop law and integrationist ways and contribute to European integration, or to contribute to integration as it had done in Europe. Right? So this has really made me skeptical. And the question is, what remains from these experiences, from these types of experiences in terms of normative lessons? And I want to mention two that I think are relevant, and we've developed some of those together in joint work in critiquing the EU model and others, and we're currently doing some work together with Yuri also on this idea of the EU model and its normative implications. So I think a first important lesson in trying to export, which the EU has done extensively, I'm not sure how aware you are, but the EU has really gone around the world and spent a lot of money and provided expertise in order to build regional institutions along EU lines in other parts of the world. So the first normative implications, I think, that is that agency should clearly rest with the other side rather than with European actors themselves. That is, others need to be in the driving seat and deciding what it is they want to learn from Europe, what it is that they want to take from Europe, and the EU shouldn't be kind of telling them, as it has too often done. I think the normative reason for why that is important are the echoes of colonialism that some of you have worked on, right? Quite a few European member states are former colonial empires, and it resonates badly if you go around the world 60 years after decolonization, try to tell others how they ought to organize their political affairs. But there's also good analytical reason, which is that things are different. Contexts are different, thanks. And others, local actors, tend to know better about these contexts than do EU actors themselves. Second and final point. I think that we should not think of, maybe we're going to have a little bit of time to talk about what the EU model is and what it means. But if we want to use that term, we should not think of it as kind of a ready-made template that can simply be adopted and ought to be adopted in its entirety in other regions. But we should think of it as something that can aspire. And part of the work that we've done is try to distinguish different ways of thinking about the term model that moves away from how architects think of models as a small replication of a bigger thing, right? Towards something, towards the type of model that artists use when they want to get an inspiration for, say, their expressionist leanings, right? And so I don't think that the EU can do much to promote its model abroad in terms of activism, but it's best to think about promotion in terms of standing as a successful example that others look at from the outside and can draw the lessons that they themselves want to draw against the background of their own experiences, which I think is important. And this brings us back in some ways to the first panel, which unfortunately I missed, and I apologize for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias. And finally, Kira.
So I've given my provocative remarks today. The provisional title of caricature and co-optation decentering Europe in a post-European world. I know I don't want to cry on this now. So what I'm not going to do is try and communicate to you what Calypso has meant to me. I'm going to do something incredibly dry instead, and I'm going to read out the acknowledgement section of my upcoming book, in which Calypso features. I was told to tone it down. I've toned it down. Now, the book itself is called Cosmopolitan Elites, Indian Diplomats and the Social Hierarchies of Global Order. And the global order bit is, of course, Andy Harrell. Andy Harrell is my official supervisor, and the Cosmopolitan Elites bit is Calypso, through and through. Critical of the cosmopolitan elites, of which we potentially ourselves are a member. Now, the notable thing here is that the thesis was not supervised by Calypso, and for much of the process, we were in completely different countries, sometimes in different continents. So the acknowledgement agreed to be read also in that context. So with quiet understatement, so as not to come across as sycophantic and unserious as a young female scholar. Calypso has been my unofficial mentor, sometime employer, and forever role model and friend since she first taught me to decenter IR through my MPhil degree in IR in 2016. She convinced me that IR could be a much more creative field of inquiry than conventional methods training had discipline we used to be there, if you've ever had encounters with IR. She has been generous in offering me opportunities to work and network, as well as to jointly reflect on the role of academics in the world and the role of women in academia. She has offered perceptive comments on several drafts of the work found in this book and has always shown more faith in the project than I ever did. Now, I said it's Calypso who first taught me to decenter IR, and in many ways, my entire academic career since has just been trying to figure out what decentering means, what it can mean. What has emerged for me in the last 2 years are two important caveats or challenges to the decentering agenda, how this kind of agenda should unfold in IR in a sort of post-European world, in a sort of kill your darlings kind of way. I think Calypso would agree that the things we criticize most fiercely are the things that we love the most, right? This is what we're critical of the European project, and this is why I'm critical of the decentering agenda now. So we must interrogate which kinds of political imagination structure our interpretations of Europe, who is allowed to imagine this Europe, and especially how it is imagined outside of Europe, right? So, and what this means for the ethics and politics of decentering. Decentering of Europe cannot happen by or through Europeans alone at conferences in Oxford. We cannot have this ironically Eurocentric way of decentering. But in strange ways, there are actually some incentives for extra-European elites to either resist or pervert this decentering agenda themselves. I have two examples here, both from India, because that's the country that I ostensibly work on. I've been told I'm a trouble down. This is an article I published last year, so I might not work on India for much longer, but here goes. So one is the resistance to updated imageries of Europe that you sometimes encounter among India's liberal elites who were in charge until 2019, so all the way from 1947 to 2014, sorry. The other is the perversion of the decentering agenda that is now underway among right-wing populists such as Narendra Modi, though I see a wider pattern here that I will return to. And I call these two challenges, one of caricature and the other one of co-optation. Now, first on caricature, much of the decentering agenda, of course, is not only about seeing Europe in a broader context, but moving away from a stale imagery of Europe and imagining it anew. No, the book forced me or allowed me to do 85 interviews with Indian ministers, diplomats, and officials. And in our conversations, these supposedly anti-imperial, non-aligned third-worldist actors showed a strange ambivalence towards Europe. On the one hand, of course, their anti-imperialist politics meant that they were sympathetic to what we would call the decentering agenda. But on the other hand, the liberal elites that used to govern India are also socially wedded to a reading of international society narrated from the position of European power. In our conversations, it was them who kept centering Europe. They insisted, when we talked about what it means to be a good diplomat, a good sort of cosmopolitan, that it was paramount in the world of diplomacy to be able to sort of quote classics of French literature in the original language, or sort of make sly, well-timed yes minister references during conversation. That it was crucial to know one's etiquette around wine and knives and forks. Provincializing or decentering Europe must sort of therefore look at looking at the ways in which Europe is an imagined Europe, is Europe as metonym, and how that has played a lot of role in how Indian elites situate themselves in the world. I'm going to have another quote here, which is from Bechev on the sort of great mental creation of Europe, because it's a joint exercise. It is not that we have a vision of Europe that we've brought to the world. It's always been an encounter. Chakravarti says, I was aware that there were and still are many Europes, real, historical, and fantasized. Perhaps the boundaries between them are porous. My concern, however, was the Europe that was historically a haunter in debates on modernity in India. This Europe was made in the image of colonizing power, and the making of such a Europe was not an act of Europeans alone. This Europe was, in the sense in which Levi-Strauss once used the word, a founding myth for emancipatory thought and movement in India. So this sort of imagery of colonially infected aristocratic Europe is co-created by the elites. And the continued dominance of this kind of imagery in spaces like India, to some extent, is a cultural projection. This Europe no longer exists, but in the heads of these liberal elites, it fixes and internalizes a sort of partial vision of Europe with exaggerated features. I'm reminded here of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. The main character, Tobias, and I say, perhaps it would be fair to say that Europe repeats itself in India as farce. But Chakrabarti also reminds us that there are, at the beginning of the quote, that there are many Europes, right? We have a proud legacy of anti-imperialist campaigning, anti-nationalism, regionalism, internationalism, social Europe, Europe from below, all the kinds of things that Calypso has dedicated her life to defending. So why this singular reading of Europe among a sort of a liberal elite in a non-European space? And I argue that it allows a very particular kind of upper caste, Oxbridge-educated India to claim unique abilities to represent India to the world, to converse with the West, and to act as a kind of interpreter class. So what we have is a politically motivated caricature propagated by sort of liberal elites who want that kind of Europe to exist because they have a unique ability to converse within it. And so in some way, we have to think not only about race when we think about the decentering agenda, but about class. So that's the sort of first confusion that I've encountered. And the second point is on co-optation, and I think Nora was going to come to this, which is for any scholar who's deeply wedded to an emancipatory agenda and how they think about their work. Recent developments in India, but also Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, before Lula in Brazil. There are some ethical dilemmas to doing decentering work. I'm currently very interested in studying a global dynamic whereby populist leaders in post-colonial nations appropriate anti-imperial language traditionally used by left-wing liberation movements to conservative ends. And so a critique of Western-centric, Eurocentric order making is quite easily appropriated by these regimes to justify the domestic project of exclusion. So Modi, Erdogan, Putin have all learned to express their political program in the language of imperial bias, national self-determination, decolonization of the mind, rooting out of comprador classes. And there are, at least in India, concrete examples of the work of senior post-colonial scholars being harnessed to articulate an exclusionary politics in political speeches. There are BJP functionaries to say, to quote, and they quote a post-colonial scholar. Right? And this is the strategic co-optation, right? So the appropriation of post-colonial language is a discursive method which reads all foreign critique as an imperial incursion and all domestic critique as a failed people naivization of the Indian mind. So when the BBC airs a documentary that is critical of Modi, the Indian government accuses the BBC of suffering from an imperial hangover, right? The argument is that Europe isn't over itself and Europe hasn't really done decentering, and if we truly, implemented the decentering agenda, we would find this kind of indigenous, independent Indian thinking entirely emancipatory. The documentary is now banned across the country, by the way. Friends who were harassed by the police for showing it at Jamie. So this is anti-democratic repression dressed up in the language of decolonial liberation. I have a working paper on this phenomenon, and I believe has a very particular cultural grammar to it, and maybe Hannah Arendt can help us for another day. I'll just end on this sort of thinking together point, which is this is not an equation that the decentering agenda, I think, has a really good way of dealing with at the moment, and I worry sometimes that we've given birth to this beautiful, potentially well-meaning project, and now it's been harnessed to win dark fights that are not our own. Paul Freire, in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has this adage that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, when education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And so what will a liberating education in spaces like this, but most crucially outside of Europe, what would that look like? What might the decentering agenda look like that cannot be appropriated? So we must find a way of making sense of these ethical dilemmas, because academic work is always political work. We must find and create new ways of furthering the decentering agenda. We must sharpen the theoretical language and tighten the political categories that we use to make sense of the political overlap and discursive snippages between post-colonialism and populism, and between frankly, decentering and demagoguery.
Thank you very much, Kira. That was great. Well, we had 4 fantastic presentations. If I ask our hegemon, can we take an extra quarter of an hour for Q&A? Give us about 40 minutes.
It's often the vast.
Okay.
I
Well,
think we're getting someone on screen who put a hand up.
Yeah, I know. So we also have with us Robert House on screen, editing scholar, collaborator, and friend of Philip's. Rob, I know you have to go at some point. Would you like to come in now or a bit later in the discussion? Can you hear me at all?
There you go.
Which point? It disappeared. While we're waiting for Rob, because we are here, let's take a look. Let's take a few questions from it. We would like to pick up. Items. Okay, so one question I would like us to come to in the course of this conversation is a straightforward prescriptive one, which is how should Europe, specifically the EU, actually speak to India or speak to China or speak to other countries? Did you say that was a panel?
Yeah.
Rob is back. Rob, did you want to come in now?
Sure. So it's a great pleasure to be here, if only very briefly, to reflect on the themes that many of us have explored, I think, fruitfully with Calypso in these last years. I don't think that I would have been drawn into saying much publicly about Europe, except through my collaboration with Calypso, which began quite a few years ago when I was, visiting professor at Harvard, in an early stage of my teaching career. Most relevant to the discussion we've just had, I think, is a piece Calypso and I wrote called "This Is My Utopia," where we argued, and I think the argument is very consistent with many of the observations that the panelists have just been making about the question of a European model, the question of its application or projection elsewhere, that in fact, what the European elites were exporting was really a fantasy of the EU that they weren't able to realize within the EU itself. So a kind of ersatz for the satisfaction of realizing it was to present it as an attractive narrative to the unsuspecting elsewhere. And this really fast forwarding to today, what really strikes me is that this continues to be done, as one of the panelists said, including with considerable investments of money and diplomatic resources. But what's done very little, and what seems to be impossible for the European elites the EU elites really to do, through some combination of anxiety and arrogance, perhaps, is to reflect on the EU's failures. I mean, one could spend much of one's life going to conferences where EU bureaucrats or advocates of the EU project keep asking, why don't people agree with us, or why don't the populace go along with us? But what they don't ever seem to ask is whether actually there are failures and limits to the project that ought to be as much a part of public discourse about it as advertising, the fantasy of of Europe as a fully integrated, unified political community of free and equal citizens. And perhaps it's about time to do it after what was imposed by the Eurozone on Greece and other less perhaps truly criminal failures of the European project. A little modesty and reconsideration perhaps in the end would strengthen Europe, especially against the dreaded quote unquote populists.
Thank you very much, Rob. Preach less, listen more. When you speak more self-criticism. We now have three people.
I want to come back to this notion of post-colonial, post-imperial, and when the war in Ukraine started, there was kind of a statement making the rounds among Bosnian friends of mine who if you remember, one of the first justification was the re-establishment of the Russian Empire or something, at least part of the discourse, and they were posting things like, if Austria-Hungary tries to do the same, I will fight everyone who tries to stop them. Because we can actually understand that not as a longing for the return of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Bosnia, but rather as a deep disappointment with what the European project has become. And I think when we talk about deconstruction of this European model, and also involving the local agency, giving it more credence, it's important to really think about what are the constitutive elements of this European value system on which we cannot negotiate, be it the rule of law, be it human rights, be it democracy, even though there are certain different forms of democracy that we can discuss. But we need to find the kind of a nucleus and then let the locals form their systems around this nucleus, and then I think the European model has kind of a future, if you will, because as it stands at the moment, I don't really see any pull effect from the European integration as far as the Western Balkans is concerned. But not only that, I mean, I live in Switzerland, whereas 10 years ago, half of the Swiss population wanted to join the European Union. That number is down to 10% currently, without actually having concluded any more trade deals. So just
thank you very much. I'll collect you.
Mine was a question to Kira, but I'd also like to hear Philip's views on this. So this phenomenon is really interesting that you described, that these progressive left-wing concepts are taken over by these regressive people. And the people who originated these terms would probably cringe very often when they're used by them. And you said one response should be that we sharpen our concepts and rethink it. But I wonder, is that really the best strategy? What sort of strategy should we put? Because you can define a concept as nicely and sharply as you can. It might still be abused. Yeah. So I wonder to what extent it isn't really in the end. Well, I don't know what it is. What are other strategies and solutions there? So it's an interesting phenomenon. Just want to hear more about it.
Thanks very much. Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in a world of hard multipolar international politics, how do you go about becoming more modest or the center or less hegemonic without endangering your position in the world?
Thank you very much. I'll take one more from me.
Okay, so one comment and one question very briefly. Yes, whenever the European model tried to be exported, and there are plenty of other examples, also Central American integration, when they created a parliament, a common parliament, none of this has worked. But I think one of the key, and in Africa, I didn't either, you gave one example. I think one of the key arguments why not, and maybe you had this in the homogeneous democratic countries, these countries don't have strong institutions that could support such a model. And that's often forgotten in this idealism that the European peace model of integration can be exported. And then I would like to pose a question: what does the future enlargement process need to look like in order to get to this transformation that the EU needs for the Western Balkans, for Ukraine? Because obviously the process as it has worked until now isn't working, because we don't see the transformation of the Western Balkans to stable democracies, rule of law, etc.
Thank you very much. I see Nora has her hand up. So Nora, would you like to pick and choose between those questions?
Sure. Yeah, it was. I wanted to build on the question that to Kira and Calypso that also picked up on the point that I was closing with and wanted to elaborate a bit more on about the danger of weaponization of post-colonial analytics and ethics, and sort of in answer to that question. And I'd love to hear more what the panelists and others have to say about this as well. I have a couple of sort of tentative answers to how one can go about doing that. The first has to do with this idea of relational learning. And this is something that I've written about with Emilian Kowalski in our special issue of Global Studies Quarterly that we entitled From Transatlantic Order to Afro-your-Asian Worlds ? Reimagining IR as interlocking regional worlds. So it's the idea that there are situated positions that we all find ourselves in. It could be Bosnia, it could be Ankara, it could be Moscow, it could be Brussels. And from these situated positions, we have insights, and those insights can help us to work through both the added value of post-colonial analytics, but also the sort of their dirty underbellies, right? The way that they're weaponized. And I put into the chat just a sort of an empirical data point that very much speaks to what Kira was saying, that, for example, the newly appointed head of Turkey's intelligence agency is actually a former post-colonial theorist. And indeed, ideas like epistemic justice and sort of Western neo-imperialism, are very much evoked, even in Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine. The first 10 minutes of the speech was all about Western neo-imperialism as the impetus. And so in this context, I think what we really need to do is learn relationally from folks in these places. This also has to do with what Tobias was saying, with what Rob was saying. So, for example, analysts in and of Turkey, analysts in and of Russia, analysts from formerly colonized spaces within the European Union have been writing about and pointing out these dynamics for years. So there's a very vibrant field and conversations going on, oftentimes not in English, but in European context, very much in intelligible languages, where there's insights really into the cutting edge about how some of these more kind of critical categories have been weaponized, and how to try and sort of salvage the baby despite the bathwater, to use Dimo's point as well. So I think really kind of taking a deep dive into those worlds, these situated positionalities where people have sort of lived experiences that can help to mitigate against these dangers and help to perhaps save this project of decentering from being abused. And then a second just sort of footnote to that is I've published something with Sarah Wolf, David Ghazi, and Daniel Huber on contrapuntal listening. So this is a method inspired by Edward Said's notion of the counterpoint as a post-colonial approach to listening to the voices of those who've been silenced, or listening to the voices that are dissonant from the mainstream. So so basically in JCMS we argue for contrapuntal listening as a method. Listen to listen if you're developing a policy about migration, listen to migrants. If you're developing a policy about Turkey, listen to Turkish dissidents. And in fact, what we see happening all too often is that there's this narrative of kind of projecting sort of the EU model is best practice, but but then there's kind of a sigh of relief when the Erdogans win, or we roll out the red carpet for the Modis here in Washington, because it enables us to not listen to the counterpoint, which is actually cacophonous all around us, but we ignore it all the time in our own perils. So that was just kind of what I was going to finish on, that builds on the question that was asked to Kira and Calypso.
Thank you very much, Nora. I'll go to Kira first, but then the question directly to you.
You were kind of consciously rescued. I mean, I suppose part of my anxiety is that I'm not entirely sure that these are our terms and that we can be so territorial about them, and that we, especially as European scholars, can give boundary conditions to how these theories develop, and that is sort of the sort of bigger ethical dilemma, right? One is the question of resistance, and then the second question is then one of this understanding of gatekeeping around theories, right? With a sort of weird Eurocentric slant to them. Often I sort of wonder if it isn't the inverse, that it's the lack of modesty that is threatening Europe's standing in the world. Because the lack of modesty is really what repels partners. For example, in South Bloc, and then it's this understanding that Europe comes in with this big attitude. So if you get rid of that attitude, I mean, there'd be like a nice gendering IR sort of angle to this whole conversation about confidence and modesty and whatever. But I wonder if it isn't the inverse. I'm open to being persuaded, by the way. And then to bring two questions together, which is sort of how should the EU speak to countries like India? I suppose that the easy sly way of answering it that is it should be with India and not to India. But that's too easy, I'm not going to do that. But solidarity can't be something that we do onto others, right? And then sort of to bring that with the question of what is the nucleus of the sort of values, like what's the core that can't be, you know? And I'm not sure that we can observe those values in action even inside the European Union, which brings together quite a few of these things to one of my favorite overused and potentially made up quotes, which are the only good forms of quotes that you bring in your sort of contributions, which is when Gandhi was asked about Western civilization, right? And he said, I think it would be a great idea. I think we should do that when we do model talk. So instead of saying, well, we have this model, can it be exported, so on and so forth, we say, look, we have this model, we haven't gotten there yet. We've never really tried it. We have all these ideals, we haven't lived up to them. Can we jointly imagine what it would look like for both sides to try and live up to this?
Timo, what kind of enlargement would be transformative?
Look, let's be honest about it. We cannot just redesign policies in the center and then focus something different. It's not how it works. You can have the best designed set of tools and incentives. The outcome is really similar, unless there is a dynamic from within. And that's the lesson of Central Europe. What Manalo Bakul quoted the time passing. It's not that somebody in the European Commission went there in the Czech Republic and pushed the button and drafted the document and that's the end of the story. No. So I'm really skeptical of Western Balkans. Unless, again, there is a push. And we have some green shoots here and there, but it's not the real deal. I'm a bit more optimistic about Ukraine, actually. Why? Well, because war is an extreme set of circumstances. It has a profoundly transformative effect on society. It might not be lasting. In fact, many of those posts around the world, if you look at the resilience of authoritarian regime, there's some good work suggesting that the liberation movements don't feel worse authoritarian, but they're very resilient. But Ukraine is doing the job. And by the way, Europeanization, if you look over those 20 years since the first Maidan, Ukraine has done a very decent job with Europeanization, not because of the EU. In fact, the EU did everything to postpone the further process. But look at trade flows, level of convergence. Now, if you're Ukrainian, Europe is open to you. So it's not a disaster. And I think this whole agenda, going back to some of the other questions of talking to the other, I'm really with Kira here because there is the risk of essentializing the other. And in Russia, who do you talk to? Do you go to talk to Putin or Patrushev and those people? Who will tell you that Americans are there to destroy Europe and to make everyone change their agenda tomorrow and destroy Russia and they're about to invade also through Ukraine. Do you talk to Navalny? You may get a very different story. Do you talk to the person that speaks in Ekaterinburg, who might be a bit useful about Europe? I also don't agree with Nora when she said, you know, who are Europeans to preach to the Russians? These are falsified. Brussels is imperial, Russia is imperial. Well, the Brussels Empire what is the worst they can do to you, harm-wise? I mean, what? Yeah. Well, maybe because of
Or you could death.
yeah. Well, it's right. So tomorrow, Poland won't receive the next tranche under the resilience and recovery facility. And what can Putin do? Well, you can see what he can do. I mean, he can do a lot of harm. He can destroy your house because he doesn't like it. And he get away with it. I mean, Salisbury didn't happen because of Brussels. It happened because of a bunch of guys in jail who decided that they wanted to take a chance on the UK. So there is a difference. It's not all the same, I think. And there's the danger of this ethic of talking to the other. You have to also understand the other. The other might be pluralistic, might be multiple, there might be tension, there might be conflicts and struggles. And I do agree, I think this whole self-flagellation ethic in Europe is highlighted by people. Like Algeria was part of the EU at the beginning. So they had a liberation war, and it has this post-colonial regime, which is embedded there in Britain itself, with Onar. But it doesn't mean they're nice people, right? Again, if I want to do business with the EU Commissioner, it's done that they are arrogant and preachy with your open cuts and of Europe. And I go back to autumn finally. Yeah, I mean, circumstances again. Europe has, by default, under pressure to do more and more and more. Who they have imagined before 24th of February 2022 that some money, and the Irish mentioned it as well, but it's worth repeating that EU budget funds will be going into purchasing arms. So I mean, good to be modest and think about limitations for the can achieve, but I mean, life is just tough, and it's a tough world. You have to punch as well.
Right. Sure, thanks. I'm gonna come back to a couple questions, Tim's, Rob's, Autumn's, about how the EU should relate, and how it can keep its ground in an increasingly competitive multilateral world. One of the things that struck me most about doing all that research on kind of the EU's influence on other regions is that the failure of trying to do something like the EU is pervasive, as Simona just mentioned, but it continues inspiring people. So even though Africans have tried since the 1960s to adopt the EU model, and it's failed most of the time, they keep on talking a lot about the EU model, which makes me think that there's something inspiring in that very idea. The question is, what can Europe do in order to kind of work with that or to build on that when it deals with other parts of the world? And I think my main point is that it needs to keep its own house in order. That it's really as much about what it does internally as how it acts externally. And I think there's a really big opportunity in the current situation. It's always seen as crisis, and in many ways it is. But Europe is obviously normalizing at the moment, in the sense that maybe for the first time in its history, it has to deal with really deep internal conflict. It's not just about fixing some kind of policy failure, you know, the euro doesn't work or our migration system doesn't work. Policy failure, I think, happens all the time, everywhere, right? This is not what really damages the EU. And other regions have policy failure like the EU does, but they have often deeper types of conflict inside the regions, like Europe does at the moment, right? What do you do when there's fundamental disagreements on ideology? And I think others do observe very carefully about what the EU is doing about countries like Poland and Hungary, and whether it's able to not just fix policy failures, but whether it's able to deal with fundamental ideological and normative disagreement on the inside. So I think what will come out of that, if Europe kind of bounces back stronger than before, or if it really flounders, is that the word? On these problems is, I think, something that is important to try to keep the house in order, and is something that's being closely watched.
Thank you very much for that. So what I'm going to do now is just take one last round, including Calypso, and then go back to the panelists for the last round of responses. So if anyone would like an opportunity, this is your opportunity. While you're thinking about it, Eamon, there, and then I can't see it. Yeah, sorry.
Yes,
Eamon, sorry.
very inspiring discussion again, and I come back to the point of you promoting its model abroad. I'm very sympathetic to your idea that it shouldn't be schematic, that you could listen and co-create, and in other words, that the EU should be promoting the outcomes of democracy and human rights respect, not a particular structure that has worked in Europe. But at the same time, I strongly believe it needs to continue making that effort. And I think that there are things that it can point to as successes or as helpful initiatives. Working, for example, with the Latino in different ways help develop an interregional structure, working to develop civil society bodies in several countries and so on. So I think that the plainly you've hit on the harder area, because creating an international court with teeth is probably, the hardest thing you can undertake. And even in that case, the reason for the failure of the tribunal lies with SADC, not with the European Union, as you described here. So, I think it's the EU is condemned to act as Sisyphus, continue to roll the boulder up the hill, and if it fails next time, it needs to try and fail better. It must continue doing it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this great panel. I have a question for Tobias and Kate. The EU model, I've read both of your papers on that one, and I actually used part of it for my research, where I was looking at a diffusion of the Turkish model after the Arab uprising to a Tunisian Islamic Party and an Egyptian Islamic Party. And what I argued is the AKP, Erdogan had used EU as a legitimization for itself to be seen as an able governing actor. And then what it learned from the quote-unquote EU model is modular tactics and strategies. And it has diffused and transpired to other regions like that. But in this sense, there is no value, no principle. It's just modular tactics of how to be successful in a neoliberal sense. So what do you think that says about the EU model? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm speechless. But I want to, in fact, respond to Yuri's, but which was a question inspired by all of your, wonderful reflections, really continuing this conversation we've had since 2005, when we created the Renew, Rethinking Europe in a Non-European World. Remember, Nora, that's just when we had met. And you were taking care of Daphne too, in addition. So that's for the feminist part that we were all juggling. And I would say that, yes, a lot of what we are saying ought to be done has to do with Nora's contrapunctual listening and all of that. And indeed, with our work with Yuri and Toby, we talk a lot about self-reflexiveness. So we have, because we're good academics, a tendency, and it's not wrong, to be ideational first. And perhaps that's what comes first, is ideas. But just to push back a tiny bit, or if not push back, supplement this. To me, the moment the EU will be credible, both to itself and to the world, is when it puts its money where its mouth is. When it hurts. Real action that makes a difference is when somehow it does something to your power and interest. And sorry, I don't want to be a hardcore, IR realist here, so I apologize to all of us critical theorists. But so when does it hurt? First of all, so it's 4 points here. Toby, to keep your house in order. All of you, one way or another, have talked about turning the gaze inside. Lead by example. It's not lead, but show by example. So, okay, we all agree on that. But that's super hard. Addison, I wrote a whole book to try to convince, some sort of broader public, please buy the book, Citizens Guide to the Rule of Law, why we must fight for the most precious human invention of all time. And what you find is that inside, Europe has not managed, after 800 years, and I'm speaking in this country, of fashioning the rule of law to make it really owned by its citizens, like oxygen. Really, when you don't have oxygen, it's the only time you realize you need it. Now, if the EU can't do that inside, how can it preach it outside, right, Addis? And you and I have had hundreds of hours of conversation about that. But the same for Kira's, multiculturalism and the subversion of ours, because we don't do it well at all, but it will cost to integrate, to deconstruct hierarchies inside our own societies in really fundamental ways. So it is costly. But second, Dimo, let's not essentialize the others. Indeed not. But Nora, I was interested that you didn't bring in one of our many pet concepts that we're playing with together for so many years, double decentering. Our response, of course, is to say when you decenter to other countries, is it to the country, to the government, to the neo-imperial powers and autocratic strongmen? No, we have to decenter to civil society, citizens, trade unions over there, whoever is struggling, because that's what the world is made of, is struggles that are always on the losing end. Now, to go and support in Egypt, civil society group might cost literally billion, because we will lose arms trade, mega armament deal with Sisi. That's for sure, or kind of for sure. Nothing is sure anywhere, especially not in international relations. So there's a geopolitical dimension to decentering, which of course is highly costly, especially to go to double decentering. And in fact, yet we can't claim all around that we have done this and we have set up, even that sentence, set up civil society group. Because as Dimo said so rightly, it's all about empowering groups that are setting themselves up. So how do you do that? Well, you lose control. And that leads me to my third point about control. Because Dimo, you reminded us, well, they have agency on the other side. They don't do what we ask them to do. Look at the Balkans. They all love Russia. Well, not all, but so
They love themselves.
they love it. And they will do strategic hedging in the Balkans, in Africa, and everywhere else in the world. And we need to understand that strategic hedging, hey, my kids do it all the time, still to this day, sorry, Ari, between their dad and me. I mean, as we all did it with our parents. So there is nothing more human than strategic hedging. And frankly, if you're the weak, you're going to do that. And you should do it. And if they want we want strategic autonomy. Give them their strategic autonomy, even if they're the bad guys. And then we kind of play power games around that. But I never hear EU powers that be, speak about, the South Africa strategic autonomy in the same breath as we speak about ours. How are our strategic autonomies compatible? So you decenter and recenter at the same time, which leads me to my fourth point, which is that we do have a power surplus in the EU, in the world, and perhaps that's what Arthur meant when he said, maybe don't be so humble, or even what Dimo means. Yeah, it's regulation through trade, imposing our norms and values, thanks to our access to our single market. And Rob is gone now, but we, and several of my students working with me on trade weren't able to come this time. But how shocking is it to see the EU proclaim multilateralism, values of inclusion, etc., and its bigger power instrument in the world is unilateral, is simply unilaterally imposing, thanks to its single market, its own values. And man, maybe it's good, maybe it's not good. But the point is, if we want to give the other side agency, then we should do it where it hurts. Because again, here, giving agency means cooperative, very complex types of networks of cooperation. And then you don't control exactly what they do, or GDPR or anything else. So all I'm trying to say here is let's hold in the same breath ideational listening and all of these good things, and hardcore power interest costs. But that is not to say that anything that has been said I love it. And we're going to continue writing about and thinking about how the EU can better do that.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm going to add two comments, questions of my own, and then I'll come back to the panel in reverse order, traditional pattern. The first is, we're back with the perennial problem of Europe's exceptionalist universalism, or universalist exception, which is either hypocrisy or a contradiction in terms, or both. It's not a contradiction for Viktor Orban. That is to say, there is empirically a set of European values which are intrinsically exceptional. But what we call European values, specifically the values of the EU, are Enlightenment values and therefore necessarily universalist. And that is where the tension comes. What do we do about it? I mean, to pick up what Calypso said, I think there are two areas where the rubber hits the road. One is clearly immigration. We say, here's this wonderful model we have in Europe. The last thing you can do is access it, and if you try, we'll let you drown in the Mediterranean. The other, which we talk about not too little, Calypso, put your money where your mouth is, development. I mean, one part of addressing this problem would be to have a much more serious and substantive development policy, which we talk about far too little, and most of our countries dedicate less than 0.7% of GDP to it. So what do we do about universalist exception? The second point, I mean, there's been a lot of common ground that I've heard here, not preaching, listening, being dialogical, self-criticism, self-reflection, double D-centered, contrapuntal listening, and so on. But how exactly? How does that actually translate in how the EU relates to India, or how the EU relates to Turkey, or how the EU relates to Russia? How do you make those difficult trade-offs between interest and values? And then the most fundamental question is the one posed by Emmanuel Wallerstein in his book on European universalism. What Wallerstein's position is, universal values don't exist out there in some concrete way, but they can be created. We can, in a dialogical process, in a conversation between, if you like, the West and the rest, create those values. And I'd be very interested to know what you all think of that rather radical inclusion. So let's go in reverse order, starting with Gary.
I'm trying to practice this thing where if I don't have anything interesting to say, I don't say anything at all. And I feel like I'm a little bit in that position. So I'll keep it very brief and also not attempt to do things that I think I would only be trying to say that to save face in front of everyone. One thing is that I think hypocrisy is good. I say that we were having a conversation about Boris Johnson and people like Trump and why they come across as so authentic. And you can't be charged with hypocrisy if you've never tried to aspire to any principles, right? That's how you come across as authentic. So my thing is hypocrisy is great. I have nothing against hypocrisy. We need to do a better job at actually trying to aspire to those values. Hypocrisy itself is wonderful, and it is also, I think the shame that comes with knowing you're being hypocritical is an important political. Put your money where your mouth is exactly that. That's also sort of, I think, something that we all do in our private lives, trying to distinguish between what a principle is and what a preference is, right? We have a preference for decentral when it costs us nothing, but the difference is principle is something for which you are willing to exchange something. And this sort of comes back to Yuri's point earlier on solidarity also needing to cost you something and needing to require taking sides, right? And I think that's a really interesting tension with what Tim is saying about universalism, which is that our universalism is also by necessity agonistic, right? It isn't necessarily agonistic against extra-European powers, but it is agonistic against certain types of political principles, sorry. And those are not principles that are universally held by all of Europe and not held elsewhere, right? So I think if you move away from a reading of universalistic values that are not tied to the nation state, and that's the hierarchy against which we measure states, but sort of transnational alliances, right? Where in Europe are we trying to create this kind of Europe? It is not actually welcoming of everyone, and it isn't universalistic in that sense. But can you build alliances? Again, this is the class question, this is a positionality question. That is universalistic, but not sort of in the traditional way that we've done it. But mostly, I think my whole takeaway is that maybe we shouldn't, self-flagellation is great, but maybe we shouldn't, jettison the idea of hypocrisy at all.
Thank you. Tobias.
Sure. A lot of things on the table. I'll keep it at two. One to second Calypso's point about losing control once you give agency to the other side. I think that is really essential. With actorness and agency comes the illusion in some ways that you're in control, that you've got control over a situation. And when you act in more passive ways and more kind of exemplary ways, you do lose control. And that's tough. That's difficult to do. What I think it allows for, though, is that it allows for seeing how others define the EU model. And that comes back to a question we heard here, that others might be inspired by things in the EU model that you yourself haven't really thought about, that you yourself don't really think of as a part of this thing, or at least as a good part of this thing. And all of a sudden you realize maybe there's darker sides to our own model than we ourselves know and believe in or think. And that opportunity only arises when you hear what others do and how they act upon this. That's my first point. Second point on hypocrisy, but I think it's important to talk about whether hypocrisy is good or bad, no doubt. But I think hypocrisy is inherent to politics. It's inherent to the idea of compromise. You formulate ideals before you engage in politics. And the compromise means that you are not going to achieve the ideals, but stay below them. And so I think when you believe in a politics of compromise and a politics of negotiation, that outcomes are, to a larger or lesser degree, hypocritical is just inherent to that very idea. I think avoiding hypocrisy essentially means autocracy, or it means it means rule from the top, and I think that's something we don't want. So it's unavoidable in many ways.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Nora, will you join the chorus in praise of hypocrisy?
I think I love that idea, but I think there was another call that I found particularly compelling, which was the idea that we should fail better. Right. I think that's really powerful. And it relates to this post-colonial idea of Dimitar when he says at the end of his famous Provincializing Europe, that at the end of European imperialism, European thought is a gift to us all. And I think you can turn that on its head and say, a failure to decolonize Europe through self-reflection, through more humble engagement with others' agencies and others' ideas, and not a reified other, not Mearsheimer's Putin other, but the others that are, boarding ships and putting their lives in peril in order to try to come to Europe for a better life. This is that Enlightenment project, which has a sturdy underbelly, but still that did in part give the world a human rights regime that, for me, and this is what I want to sort of close on, the idea that the human rights regime, which has a genealogy in sort of European normative thought that was imbricated in various ways in colonial projects, but it's really a regime that has been incredibly empowering for vulnerable peoples around the world. At the UN, at times in the early days of the sort of institutionalization of the human rights regime, it was actually European states and European powers that were kind of pushing back against it, and it was diplomats from Jamaica, anti-apartheid advocates, civil rights activists in the United States, folks like Gandhi in India, who really did an incredible part towards pushing for the institutionalization of human rights. So, decolonizing the way we think about human rights doesn't have to mean throwing human rights out with the dirty bathwater, right? And that's what I think we really need to focus on, with great urgency. Today, we live in a world where climate crisis combined with the sort of, our post-truth space, sort of political spaces, really runs the risk of throwing the human rights regime out with the sort of neocolonial bathwater of European universalism. And again, I think here the intensive activism for years years of people who are the most vulnerable in global South context, in places like the United States, where legacies of white supremacist racism continue to structure everyday lives in really profound ways. These are the spaces where we can fail better.
Thank you very much, Nora.
Yeah, I won't talk about hypocrisy. I just want to plug in a book that came out recently by a friend of mine, Ben Judah. It's called This is Europe. And Ben actually makes a very good point about European legacies. And again, Ben's family comes from Baghdad in Aleppo originally. So these are the best Europeans who are also this gate. So he says, there are two traditions in Europe. There's a universalist tradition, Enlightenment and all that, but also there's a particularist tradition of blood and soil, which is with us, and it's not going away. Now we can reconcile with mutual recognition and such like, but also it has the face of exclusion. And this day and age, exclusionary politics have become the norm, not just in Europe, but elsewhere as well. In Europe, it's about managing the tension between universalism and particularism. And you see all kinds of manifestations. Second point, another quote by Francis Fukuyama. He actually, in the book on political order, not the last, not the end of history, he says that universalism actually is the exception, because biology, studies in behavioral sciences, plenty of evidence suggests that we tend to be particulars. We favor the likes of us. We better kind of offer them, we help them, mutually support those who look like us and share lineage. So being universalist or building the rule of law is difficult. It's not the natural state of things. It's the most liberal argument you can think of, that those things are artificial. They require effort and require dedication. So it's not easy to pull off, and that's why Europe is probably hard to replicate as well. It's the natural state of things, natural, quote unquote, is to be exclusionary, to fight for your own, to be engaged in chronic capitalism and to capture power and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure I answered the question, but final reflection.
We'll work on it. Thank you very much. Well, I thought this was an absolutely fantastic conversation. I guess we've got about 20 minutes for coffee, something like that. This ended to be in a rather unexpected place in the trade of hypocrisy, but it was a superb conversation. And I only wish some of this thinking got anywhere near Russell and how EU leaders actually do speak to the rest of the world. Because, one hears so little of it in the way the EU actually talks to the rest of the world. So please join me in thanking the panel and also commit to for time.